sustained protests in multiple cities, many of them well away from the glare of publicity in towns like Accra, like Gadara, like Medani, as well as Khartoum. And the level of violence has been as low as it is. I think this reflects on the very, very strong social consensus against this regime and the strength of the demand being made to President Bashir that it is time for him to go.
Well, let's talk about President Bashir a little bit more. How would you describe him as a man?
He's always underestimated. People always thought that he was a simple soldier without many political skills, without much education, etc. But he is very street smart, and he has one particular remarkable skill, which is he's very personable, and he has an encyclopedic knowledge of who's who. He remembers people, he remembers their families. And what he's managed to do over almost 30 years in power is have detailed personal knowledge of the officer corps of the army, the senior echelons of national intelligence. And that type of personal knowledge means that his own personal patronage networks are unsurpassed. He's like the spider at the middle of an enormous web. And no one actually in this regime can replace him in that regard, which is why, and even though he himself may want to go, he's not been in good health, he's been quite tired, he's talked about stepping down for some years, those around him recognize that there is nobody with this skill set for maintaining a highly centralized, highly personalized, very cleverly disguised system of patrimonial rule. The other feature I want to mention is that he's everybody's second choice. Anyone who's a senior officer may want to mount a coup and become president, but there's one thing that they respect with President Bashir, which is he doesn't sacrifice his own people. He may arrest you, he may remove you, but he won't kill you.
Gamal Hibani, I imagine you've had interactions with the president. How would you describe him?
I know everybody has its opinion against the other party. I would like to tell you something. President Bashir is well educated. He is one of the African leaders who have been respected and the great, very high level of relations between the Africa, and he has influenced even among African leaders. He succeeded to bring the brothers in South Sudan when other African institutions failed to do so. President Bashir is a very brave man. He led Sudan for 30 years in a very difficult regime. He protected Sudan for 30 years from international interference.
On President Bashir, I will agree on Gamar's propaganda in one point, that President Bashir is a very distinguished man as being the only sitting president who's entitled to the ICC. He has very distinguished tactic on divide and rule, not only on the opposition, but his own party. He is very funded to building too many militias and turning them against each other and being in the middle, in the center of all this, so everybody is afraid to do a coup.
Gamal Hibani, how do you perceive the president, even given this indictment by the ICC, and this sense that this is a man who has shored up his power through...
This ICC is a political issue. ICC know who is making aggressions on nations, and we know how Darfur conflict has been globalized, and international community try to divide Sudan with this. ICC is a political issue. It's not our issue here, and we are not part of ICC.
Okay, and I should explain that that's the International Criminal Court we're talking about. But on this specific idea, then, that he's shored up his power by, in a sense, surrounding himself by the military, getting to know the military, and creating militias which will underpin that too. Do you think that's a fair way to describe how he's held on to power?
Where are these militias? No militias. This is official forces. This is security forces and police forces. No militias.
We can count the Border Defense Force, the Rapid Support Forces, which is a restriction Janjaweed militia. We can count the border guards. We can count the National Intelligence and Security Forces. We can count Abu Tera bridges.
I want to give Gamara a chance to answer that. There are these named militias, many of which will be familiar to our listeners.
It's not militias. It's all official forces with its regulations and laws.
Okay. I want to just move on to talk about the nature of the opposition within Sudan. Amjad, I imagine that that's something you know a little bit about. How strong is the opposition, if you like, official or unofficial, within Sudan?
Yes, opposition for the last 30 years, as I said, President Bashir and the NCP played divide and rule for very long, and yes, there were divisions among the political parties in the opposition for very long. However, in the past few years, they came into two big alliances, which include everyone. As well, there is new movements and the professional trade unions, which also formed the Sudanese Professional Association since 2012. These now formed a collective leadership under the Declaration of Change and Freedom, which people have accepted its leadership. This tells you this is organized and this has leadership and has a plan for the transition.
Alex Duval, from your perspective, is the opposition as organized as Amjad describes?
But of course, there's no way to learn democracy and democratic organization except by practicing it. And one of the problems of Sudan has been over the last 15 years that the different attempts to have a democratic opening have always not exactly been squashed, but have been manipulated. The leaders have been bribed. The opposition parties have been bought off so that typically there'll be one faction that it falls in with President Bashir and one that goes into the opposition. So the opposition doesn't look very coherent at the moment. But the argument that there shouldn't be a change because the alternatives are not as organized as we would like is really not a strong argument. It's an argument for a managed transition, not an argument for no transition at all. And if I could just make one point about the ICC, I think the most unfortunate thing about the arrest warrant against President Bashir 10.5 years ago is that it has given him nowhere to go apart from staying in the palace. So there have been repeated indications that the president would like to step down, but he can only step down if there are some guarantees for his own personal security that he's not going to be handed over to face trial. And surely, I would say to the opposition, the fate of Sudan is a much, much bigger issue than the fate of this one man. And this is one thing that they ought to consider putting on offer, that they will do the sort of amnesty that allowed General President Ibrahim Aboud in 1964 to step down.
That's the point. I hope
I can agree to Alex's last point on the ICC, but let's differentiate between two processes. That the political processes is one thing and justice and accountability is another thing, and they are supposed to be respected, and we have to have venues.
That's the point I'd like to come back to, but we have to take a short break now. Thank you to our panel, Alex Duval, Amjad Farid Al-Tayeb and Qamar Hibani. To remind you, do let us know what you think of the programme or any ideas for topics you'd like us to look into. You can email us, therealstory@bbc.co.uk. And if you enjoy the programme, we have a podcast you can subscribe to. Just search for BBC The Real Story in your podcast app.
This is the BBC World Service, bringing you the story behind a remarkable archive of songs.
In 1940, Alexander Kulishevich, a Polish law student, was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where in secret gatherings, he and his fellow prisoners performed songs they had written.
It was all illegal, yes. They were just meeting somewhere in the evening or during the night in the corner of the barrack.
Songs that captured the brutality of life and death in the camps.
Who before wrote songs about crematorium?
And he promised to remember the melodies of those who died.
He was really the first voice of Holocaust witnessing.
I'm Alan Dean, and I'll be exploring his musical legacy.
He was this living tape recorder.
Songs from the Depths of Hell, Sunday at 14 GMT.
Coming up on The Real Story in the next half hour, rising food prices have triggered protests in Sudan. Tens of demonstrators have died, and now some people are calling for the president to go. But why is the Sudanese economy in such dire straits? The telecoms billionaire Mo Ibrahim has some tough advice for the country of his birth. And we'll discuss Sudan's role in Europe's migration programme. Has that made it immune from international criticism? That's all after a summary of the news.
BBC News with David Harper. President Trump has signed a bill to fund the US government for the next 3 weeks after it was passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. The president agreed to end the longest government shutdown in history with without securing the funding he wanted for a wall along the Mexican border. The authorities in Brazil say they don't expect to find further survivors after a mining dam collapsed, leaving 150 people missing. The dam breach in Minas Gerais unleashed a torrent of sludge that buried a cafeteria where workers were having lunch. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has appointed a veteran former diplomat as his envoy to deal with the crisis in Venezuela. He said Elliot Abrams would be responsible for all US efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela. Mr. Abrams was in charge of Latin American policy under Ronald Reagan. Police in Canada have charged an unidentified youth with 2 offences related to terrorist activity. The youth was arrested after police searched 2 houses in the town of Kingston and found an explosive substance. 3 members of a right-wing militia in the US state of Kansas have received long jail sentences for attempting to bomb an apartment building holding more than 100 Somali immigrants in 2016. Pope Francis has said it's irresponsible to see all immigrants as a threat to society.
I think there is a lot of money spent in development. We have around 30,000 kilometers of paved roads, although there is no money. Some of Gulf funds are not money. It's like investments and some support to some development projects. It's not money. It's not as big as that. I would like just to take an example. Before 1989, there was only 5 universities in all Sudan. Now there are more than 200 universities. At that time, we have only 2,000 students in universities. Now we have more than 400,000. We have more than 60 medical colleges. All this pulls in development.
Let's hear another view from Mo Ibrahim. Born in Sudan, he's a telecoms billionaire who heads the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which aims to encourage better governance in Africa, and it gives a prize to leaders who are judged to have led their country well. And it's also established the Mo Ibrahim Index, which evaluates nations' performance on criteria like rule of law, human rights, economic development, and so on. Well, I took a short walk from the BBC to his office. Hello, hi, I'm Abdullah Shah. Lovely to meet you.
Yes. Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Mo Ibrahim. You want a cup of tea or a coffee?
We've just had one, thank you. It was very well. So we've come into your rather lovely office that overlooks one of London's leafy squares. And in front of us, I just want to ask you, there are some great photographs. The middle one shows tens of women smiling at the camera. And to the right, there's a photograph of a couple of boys, a young boy and an older boy in a boat. Tell me a little bit more about these.
We held a competition on our 10th anniversary, trying to seek the views of ordinary Africa about the continent. We asked school children, we asked amateurs, we asked professional photographers, and what came out was thousands of amazing photographs, how ordinary people see the continent. Some of them are optimistic, some are really sad, some here celebrating the power of the new African women and the togetherness. It is such a diverse, and we collected all that in a book. We call it My Africa.
We wanted to talk about the protests. So you have these protests that were initially triggered by a rise in the price of bread, but now people are calling for a change of government. From your perspective, how do you see Sudan, and what do these protests tell you about the country?
What's happening in Sudan is that people are fed up. After 30 years, the life of ordinary people is just going in a downward spiral. We have people who have tight grip of power. 70% of the budget of the government is allocated to security, army. How much is left for education, health, agriculture, development, roads, electricity? And this 70% is no transparency about where this money goes. So we have a regime which is utterly corrupt and just bent on enriching itself, and they created so many militias and rapid response forces. These are military organizations parallel to the army and the police and the security. And that is a very dangerous situation that's happening there. But people were fed up. They just cannot live, cannot buy bread, which is a stable and the cheapest thing in people's life. So they have nothing to lose.
People are fed up. They're out on the streets. How significant do you think these protests are? There have, of course, been protests in the past. Is there a comparison with Egypt or Tunisia, for instance?
I think this is probably much more. If you remember, the protest in Egypt was at Tahrir Square in the middle of Cairo. That's it. The protests in Sudan is in every single town and village in Sudan, everywhere. And this is a massive popular movement without any leadership. People just got fed up and got out. The message is clear. I mean, it's really time to change.
Your foundation has an index of governance. Sudan doesn't fare very well on that. You give out awards to leaders who show good governance, and you don't always give that award out if you don't think there's a deserving candidate. Bearing all that in mind, then, how would you describe President Bashir? How much blame would you place on his shoulders for the state that you clearly feel that Sudan is in, your criticism of Sudan?
Sudan ranks 49th out of 54 countries, given that we have places like Somalia and we have also South Sudan, which is another failed state. It's dismal. It's dismal. And it just lies at the door of Bashir and his clique. Who else is responsible?
So what would you like to see happen?
I think Bashir should go. And he should try to go in peace. Should try to stop killing people, shooting at people. And he and his, will be accountable for every drop of blood. And his guys, I mean, his Speaker of the Parliament, his generals, they come on TV, and even Ali Osman, one of the leaders of the Islamic movement, they come on TV and they threaten people in very crude terms, will cut off heads, will unleash our militias. They need to know these are all crimes against humanity. And one day they're going to face justice. And so people need to be careful. The justice hand is long, and the justice arm is long. It can reach those people.
There is, of course, an indictment by the ICC against President Bashir, but do you see any outside intervention? Do you see the West or the EU, the US intervening in Sudan?
I don't see an appetite for intervention after Iraq, after Syria, after Libya, etc., and all these misadventures. And I wouldn't recommend that, even if there's appetite. This Sudanese problem should be solved by Sudanese people. All what we ask is a pressure from the international community just to make sure there is no more blood on the street. The brutality of these security forces is terrible.
But in this context, are you optimistic that there could be a peaceful transition?
I'm an optimistic person, and I always try to look up for some hope to move forward. If those guys stop shooting at people and they accept peaceful transfer of power, people say, fine, we can ask the Security Council to put off year on year the indictment by the behavior. I hate impunity. I campaigned for the four, I campaigned. But if that we're going to save lives, we're happy to do that, because I don't see any other way for peaceful transformation. Also, given that these guys back to the wall, they have all this money they collected illegally, they have the blood in their hand, those guys will fight, will unleash all their forces out there, their militias. We don't want that to happen.
Mo Ibrahim there. Gamal Hibani, he's extraordinarily critical of a country that he clearly loves. What do you say to the criticisms about the level of government expenditure, corruption, and his call for a peaceful transition?
If you want to say things like this, don't tell this to me, because I'm a politician and I know who is behind this. It was a peaceful protest, but some political parties and groups comes into this and have a specific agenda and wants this agenda to go to the end. I know there is corruption in Sudan, and we admitted this, and there is a lot of legal measurements and administrative management to slow down and to stop this corruption. The budget for 2019, it's different from last year, that comes with specific projects and programs all for social protection. Also, they increase the subsidy for health and education from 5% to 9%.
But if I can ask you about something that you just said, you talked about these protests wanting to see some other end. What do you understand that to be? Do you believe what they want is the government to change?
I think the government is not a small organization. The government is a strong government with political parties, which is all administrative bodies. It's not an NGO to take them like this.
Amjad, Farida Al-Tayeb.
I'm very happy that our colleague Waqmar have recognized that their expenditure on health and education and social security was 5%. They have 30 years to make improvement in their expenditure and in the way that they ruling the country. We are now faced by the result of 30 years, 3 decades of corruption and mismanagement and embezzlement of public funds.
So in the current context then, Mo Ibrahim was very clear he doesn't want to see any international intervention except for some kind of pressure perhaps.
Yes.
But what are the chances then of a peaceful transition, given that there are these protests already on the streets? You're not going to see this government just sort of wave goodbye. How do you see this moving on?
First, there is no way and no one wants the international intervention, and the international community itself is not willing to intervene. There is clientelistic relation between the international community and the NCP ruling regime that serves the interest of the Western countries in general in Sudan. The shady plan to stop the migration that named Khartoum process is being serving the interest of the EU by the hands of the Rapid Support Force and Janjaweed militias, and the EU seems to be happy of this. The UK continue on its strategic dialogue with Sudan for its 30 years. The US seems happy with the cooperation in terrorism in Libya with the Sudanese government, but it is the demand of the Sudanese people and it is the will of the Sudanese people to change this regime. And this will happen because Bashir cannot continue ruling 40 million persons who don't want him or the NCP.
Just to give some context, the Khartoum process that you refer to began in 2014 and it focuses on improving human rights and tackling the root causes of instability and irregular migration. So to some extent that means money is given by the EU to the government in Sudan and to other organisations that are working in Sudan, and it is about tackling what the EU sees as its problem with migration.
And the government of Sudan have announced that it gives this duty to the Rapid Support Forces, which is a restructured Janjaweed militias that was assigned repeatedly by the UN Security Council as one cause of the instability and criminal offences in Darfur.
Alex Duval, this, if you like, relationship between the EU, the US, I think the CIA is said to have its biggest office in the Middle East in Khartoum. Does that make it unlikely that anybody will challenge President Bashir and this government, and also the experience of the instability of the Arab Spring?
I think those are both very relevant. I think the general approach of the international community is we would rather have Bashir, the devil we know, than instability and chaos, given what we've seen in Libya and Yemen and so on. And then there are each country that is involved in has some interest in Sudan, also has particular interests in the status quo. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has an interest because there are several thousand Sudanese fighting in Yemen, paid for by Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Saudis. The Americans, in particular, also don't want to destabilize Bashir because, as Waqmar mentioned, President Bashir is the architect of the current peace deal in South Sudan, which is a very fragile peace deal. And it's deeply ironic that a president of Sudan would be the one to actually construct a peace deal to resolve the civil war in South Sudan. And for the United States, which is deeply invested in some sort of stability and solution for South Sudan, they don't want to upset that. So for all these reasons, it's very unlikely that we would see international action against Bashir. That said, I think clearly the writing is on the wall, and it is necessary for the African Union or the Arab League or the United Nations or whoever to begin a process, perhaps quite quietly, for a really genuine national dialogue, not a national dialogue that at the end of the day has President Bashir and his people pulling the strings so that they stay in power, but a national dialogue that is aimed at an actual transition in power, which can allow those who control the the security agencies who have the potential for destabilizing, upsetting anything, for them to step aside quietly, and for a much broader, more representative, more democratic, more forward-looking government to come to Sudan.
But you raised this earlier. You talked about this indictment of President Bashir by the International Criminal Court. He does travel to friendly countries regularly. He isn't afraid of being arrested. But to some extent, isn't this going to be a block then for him to stand down? He's obviously concerned about his future, his arrest. Is that something, in a sense, that could be negotiated away?
It's less of a block than it was, because the African Union as a whole has now taken a stand against handing over heads of state and former heads of state to the ICC. So there are places where Bashir could go in the region. Of course, he could also go to Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Qatar, who I'm sure would protect him. But the real question is not so much him, but the people around him who would not get the same level of public scrutiny and attention. And that it really is a question for the Sudanese to resolve. It can't be resolved internationally. So there needs to be a political consensus on how to handle the question of accountability, not just for human rights violations, violations of international humanitarian law, but also for corruption. How to handle those in a way that does not sufficiently antagonize very, very powerful people, that they would rather have a reversion to dictatorship or, still worse, a civil war than a transition. This is a really, really tricky question without an obvious answer.
Well, back in 2016, President Bashir spoke to the BBC's Thomas Vesey, and this is what he said about his retirement from politics.
One of the most difficult jobs here is being the president of Sudan. There are lots of problems around us, and the country is targeted from different sides. The Sudanese people are highly political. This job is very exhausting, but this will be my last term, and it will end in 2020.
So this is your last mandate?
Yes, my last mandate, inshallah.
And in 2020 there will be a new president?
2020...
In 2020, there will be a new president, and I will be an ex-president, God willing.
Waqmar Hebani, that's President Bashir speaking in 2016. Do you think it's likely that that pledge will be fulfilled?
I think this refers to the National Congress Party institution.
So he's talking about standing down as leader of your party, but not from the presidency.
Now we are preparing for the sixth conference of the party on April. Always discuss this inside the institution.
Amjad, you're laughing.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I hear the same pledge in 2010 that he will not be running in 2015. And the institution of the NCB have already announced on the Majlis al-Shura, the council, which is the second higher, they have a recommendation for al-Bashir to change the constitution and to allow al-Bashir to running again. And the question is, it's not how many times you will change the constitution. And would the NCB, is it only Bashir or it is the whole system of the NCB? The NCB as a ruling party is a corrupt regime, is a corrupt party which have taken the country hostage to the
Waqmar Hebani, is that how you see your party? You've taken the country hostage?
I think this is 30 years, started with the revolution. But
it was a coup against a democratic elected government.
Democratic way,
yes.
And they open and bring the political parties again to the political life. And we have an election in 2015, and we have also election in 2010, and now we have an election in 2020. I think all political parties should be prepared for this. Why political parties don't want this election?
In the last few minutes that we have, I want to ask each of you how you see Sudan's future. Is change inevitable? Amjad.
I think that it's an illegitimate and illegal regime. It came with a coup. This shows the illegitimacy, and its action towards its people shows the illegality with the crimes that committed against the peaceful protesters and that have been committed against people in Darfur, Brunei, Nuba Mountain, Port Sudan. The too many victims who lost their lives or being tortured, including myself, in this detention several times, and including Hebani, the sisters of my colleague, who is a brave journalist who have been detained several times in Sudan. So this illegality cannot continue forever. Bashir has to go, the NCP has to go, and we have to have an inclusive transition towards a democratic country that has a government that actually serves its people.
Hbani, do you think that the writing is on the wall for this government as it stands now?
I think everybody who wants the power should wait and prepare for 2020 and be brave to do this, not to try to go behind the things. I think this is a long story and a history of Sudan. There is a coup and then transfer to a democratic life and political life. National Congress Party announced its reform policy in 2013, and it started since that time to open and prepare the political life for everybody and for all parties. And since that, a lot of parties who they were outside are now inside, and they can tell their views, and now they have the chance to prepare for 2020 and all have the playground for transparent election.
And what about the 2,000 political leaders who are being detained right now in Khartoum in these detentions?
Alex Doval, I'm going to bring you in.
One of the saddest things about Sudan, and particularly the current leadership of Sudan, is they've had many, many opportunities to create peace, to transition towards democratization, more inclusive government, and they always miss those chances. They always ask the people to delay, they always overplay their hand, they always insist that they must have control over the process. If President Bashir is to go down in history with a fairly decent reputation, this is the opportunity that he should not miss for getting ahead of the political process, recognizing that change is inevitable and starting the process of him surrendering power to the Sudanese people without any further delay.
Alex Doval, Amjad Farid Al-Tayeb and Hbani, thank you all very much. That's it for this week on The Real Story. Thank you to all our guests. If you want to listen to the programme again or any other from the archive, you can listen back online by searching for BBC The Real Story. And if you like this week's programme, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Find us by simply